Good morning and thank you for tuning in. So this past week I had the pleasure of performing the wedding for a young bride and groom, and both of them were just stunning. The bride was radiant, beautiful, the groom was very handsome, and you could just feel the love that they shared. You know, there was an excitement, there was just a very tangible feeling of love between the two of them. And it reminded me of when Yasmin and I got married, and that feeling, and maybe you've felt this too, where you know that nothing else in the world really matters except for that other person. And your mentality is, and I think most newlyweds, their mentality is, I could live in a cardboard box as long as I'm living with you. I could eat canned beans for dinner every night as long as I'm eating them with you. Maybe you know that feeling that I'm describing. It's just kind of this idea that I don't need anything else. I don't want anything else. I just want to be with this person. And really the focus of your life is that relationship. Everything else is periphery. It's out here. What you're focused on is the person in front of you. And I think marriage oftentimes starts out that way, where it's not, the possessions that we have that are very important. It's the person that we're spending our time with. But of course, that eventually changes, right? We start realizing, well, we don't have to live in a cardboard box. We can settle down and buy a house. We don't have to eat canned beans. Or we don't have to drive this junker. And we start to slowly, inevitably emphasize stuff, things, possessions, right? Our emphasis on not needing or wanting anything else slowly and gradually diminishes, and possessions become a little bit more of a priority. And I was just thinking about this the other day. How and when does that happen? Like, how long after the wedding does the bride and the groom start to say, well, let's start to prioritize stuff instead of just our relationship? I think it's not a conscious decision that we make. I think a lot of times it's almost as if we wake up and something has suddenly shifted overnight. And all of a sudden we're more aware of this desire and need for things. And it's not just married people who feel this urge to accumulate, this drive or this desire to have and to have more. Anybody and everybody, I think, reaches a point where they feel that way. And that's where the Bible gives us a warning, to not be overtaken by the desire for money, or to not be overtaken by the things that money can bring, because there's a false promise there, and that false promise is that money can provide you with security, money can provide you with happiness and contentment. And so Jesus gives this warning. Remember that in the context of Luke chapter 12, he's still talking to his disciples, even though there's this crowd of people around them. And so let's start reading in Luke chapter 12, verse 13. Jesus is in this crowd of people, and it says, someone in the crowd... Let the truck pass. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So some seemingly random person comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, would you kind of act as the go-between, the lawyer here, and would you help me to get my share of the inheritance? And Jesus' reply is, man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? Jesus basically says, that's not what I came to do. That's not my calling. That's not who I am and what I'm about. But I do have some things to say about that. What's behind that request that the man makes? What is it that's driving this man to ask Jesus to be the judge between him and his brother and dividing the inheritance? Well, obviously, he wants to get his hands on something. He wants to get his hand on the money. He wants to get his hands on the land or the flocks. He has this desire for wealth, and he wants Jesus to help him obtain that wealth. So Jesus kind of takes this in a different direction. Jesus says in verse 15, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. So maybe Jesus there is pinpointing what is driving this man's request, and that is greed. The desire to have and to have more. And Jesus says this, life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Life does not consist of an abundance of possessions. That's a really important biblical truth that is extremely countercultural in the day and age that we live in. Because I think a lot of us are tempted to believe that actually life does consist in an abundance of possessions. That you're not going to be happy, you're not going to find contentment until you have this or you have that or you have enough money in your bank account. And Jesus says, it's not what life is about. It's not what life is about. And he goes on to tell a story to flesh that out, to illustrate his point. Jesus, it says in verse 16, told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. And he thought to himself, what should I do? I have no place to store my crops. And so there's this guy, he has some land, and his land is fruitful. And so he has a harvest, and therefore he is wealthy. He makes some, he makes some money. Now it's important in this whole passage not to assume that Jesus is saying that money is bad, or owning things is bad, or having a good prospect, whether it's in your job or your portfolio, or if you are a farmer and you own land and you have an abundant harvest, that's bad. It's not. It's definitely not. Jesus isn't saying that money in and of itself is a sinful thing, or having success in business is a sinful thing. We will get to the aspect in the part of this story where Jesus does point out what is sinful. So, and the man asked himself a good question. What should I do with this abundance? And any time we have an abundance of time or money or strength or anything, we should be asking ourselves, what should I do with this? But the thing is, what frames that question? What relationship frames that question? What priorities frame that question? How am I going to use this money? Well, in verse 18, the man says, this is what I'll do. And this is where we find out what the man prioritizes. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself," and so you kind of get the picture, right? It's the man's desires and his dreams and hopes and his appetite and his contentment that is driving the way that he's going to use his money. I'll say to myself, "You have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." Jesus says that life does not consist of an abundance of possessions. This man, though, says that life is about eating and drinking and being merry. And obviously the way to eat, drink, and to be merry is to have enough money to bankroll that, to fund that lifestyle. In verse 20 we see the result of that. God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" And so God says that perspective, that plan, that mentality is foolish. It's sinful. It's not something that you should pursue. Verse 21, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." I love when Jesus says something that's pretty much black and white and easy to understand. Life's not about possessions. Life is not about stuff. Life is about a relationship with the one who holds life in his hands. Life is about a relationship with God. And life is about a relationship with others, with your family, with your friends, with your neighbors, with strangers. Life is about your relationship with those people. And money and things are not to be prioritized over people and over God. And I think it's very interesting in this parable, something that I noticed reading it is that this man is so preoccupied about where he's going to put his stuff, what he's going to do with his abundance of possessions and his money. And there's no mention of any other relationship that he has with anybody else. For all we know, this man is a father and a husband, maybe a grandfather. But he's so preoccupied with his things that he makes no mention of his wife or his kids or his grandchildren. We don't know anything about his relationships. And so it seems really obvious that his relationships have been placed on the back burner because his possessions have been put on the front. They are his priority. And that's the problem when our life revolves around us and our life revolves around things. Our relationships suffer. Primarily, our relationship with God. He no longer is our priority. Elsewhere in Scripture it says, you can't serve two masters. You can't serve both God and mammon or money. You simply can't. And if you think that you can, then the same way that God calls this man a fool, then we are foolish when we think that we can divide our priorities between money and God. I've been reading recently the story of Job in the Old Testament. And it's really touched me, Job's perspective on the wealth that he had and the wealth that he had to give up. Job is this rich man. He's got abundant possessions, abundant children, abundant flocks and herds, and apparently abundant land to maintain his herds. He was an extremely wealthy person. We measure wealth in money now. Back then, wealth was measured in animals and in land, and Job had all that. And yet, when all of these things are taken from him, even as children, his perspective is almost shocking. When you read it, Job says, "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." So you see how there's this reality in Job's perspective that the Lord gives. And the things that he gives, the possessions that he gives, the wealth that he gives, it's here. And the Lord takes away, but blessed be the Lord. The Lord is always the context. That relationship is always the context in which wealth comes and wealth goes. And as long as this relationship is prioritized, then it doesn't matter if the wealth does come or go. Job says, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." And it's challenged me to think in terms of, what if that was me? What if it was my children who, something tragically happened to them? What if it was my house that burned down? What if it was, my bank account that was robbed? How would I react? I would probably throw a hissy fit. I would get all angry. I would at least write a Facebook post complaining about my loss. Job, though, he was able to bless the name of the Lord even when he didn't have the possessions that he previously had. And so that biblical truth, that important truth that Jesus imparts to his followers and to us, is that life is not about stuff. Life does not consist of an abundance of possession. And the Greek word for life there is life in connection with God. Zoe life, eternal life. Not quantity, living forever and ever and ever, but living in God's presence, living in connection with God. And Jesus' point then is that an abundance of possessions never leads you into a deeper relationship with God. It almost always becomes a barrier to your relationship with God. I'll never forget one of my preaching school teachers said, "I bet you've never seen a hearse towing a U-Haul." And his point was that when you're on your way to being placed in the ground, none of your stuff is coming with you. You could even be buried with it, but you can't take it with you. And so there's a bigger picture that we miss if our perspective is that possessions ought to be prioritized. And so the emphasis that Jesus puts on this story is that we need to be rich towards God. What does that look like? How do we be rich towards God? Is that just talking about putting more money in the offering? A lot of preachers would probably want to put that spin on that verse, but it's actually not talking really about money. Being rich towards God means giving Him your focus, giving Him your attention, making Him your priority, or to use kind of the the pictures used in this passage, allowing God to be your treasure, the thing that you value most highly. And so that's something that we need to think about. Does God have my attention? Does He have my heart? Does He have my time, my money? Does He have my strength? How do I use all those things? Am I using it in a way that glorifies God, or am I using it in a way that serves my own selfish purposes? And another important question, how do we keep from being distracted by stuff? I think a lot of it just begins by stopping listening to culture, because it's culture that emphasizes stuff. It's the world that puts a high value on what you own, the things you buy, where you shop, and how much money is in your bank account. That stuff doesn't even matter to God, and it shouldn't matter to us. It's the world that tells us that those things matter. One of the problems in the day and age that we live in is because we live in a postmodern world where meaning and your meaning and your identity has become subjective. You choose who you are. Well, we have to come up and craft our own identity, and one of the ways that we do that is by buying things that speak to who we feel like we are. And so if you are, we live here in Oregon, if you're an outdoors person, you have to buy a Subaru as this kind of identity marker, right? Or if you're a hard-working man, you got to buy a big old truck so that people know that that's who you are, right? Or if you're a cool mom, you got to have the biggest Suburban, right? With the DVD system for your kids to watch TV on their way to the grocery store, so that people know that that's who you are. We need to stop listening to culture, because culture is the one that tells us that stuff is important. That whole mentality of take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry, is Satan speaking through culture, tricking people into a bunch of different sins. You think about it. There's nothing wrong with eating until you become a glutton. There's nothing wrong with drinking until you become an alcoholic. There's nothing wrong with seeking pleasure until you become a hedonist. Right? God says, enjoy food within the context of our relationship. Give thanks when you sit down to eat, and enjoy that meal. Have a glass of wine, and enjoy your meal, your beverage, within the context of a relationship with me, where I am glorified in what you're doing. Enjoy life within the context of a relationship with God. But as soon as life becomes about eating and drinking and partying and having a lot of stuff, then that's where riches, wealth, money becomes dangerous. Because our satisfaction is not supposed to come through, and it can't come through things. It can only come in a relationship with God. And so Jesus really gives us some things to think about, some things to pray about, and some things to be about in our lives. So let's ask God to help us follow Jesus in prioritizing our relationship with our Father and not prioritizing our possessions. Blessings.